What's good? It's Woog. Boy, it's tough to go from Spence versus Crawford to this one, but we gonna try. We've got Jake Paul, 6 wins and 1 loss, taking on Nate Diaz, who will be making his boxing debut, but his MMA record was 21 wins and 13 losses. This is going to be Jake Paul's first 10-rounder. His first 2 fights against Anderson Gibb and Nate Robinson were 6-rounders, but those were finished in the first round and then in the second round. And then Jake's following 5 fights were all 8-rounders. That was the one against Ben Askren, the 2 against Woodley, the one against Anderson Silva, and then the most recent one against Tommy Fury, which is Jake Paul's only defeat. And you know, did the magic carpet ride kind of lose some of its luster with that 1 loss? Because remember, I mean, going into Jake Paul versus even Nate Robinson, there were people who were like, oh, Nate Robinson's a professional athlete. This YouTuber, oh, he's about to... And then we got what we got in Jake Paul knocking Nate Robinson out cold. So that kind of put the sports world on notice, where other NBA players that were thinking about it probably thought otherwise after seeing what happened to Nate Robinson, where, you know, it was clear, hey, if nothing else, Jake Paul is practicing, right? He's getting better and he's got a lightning and powerful right hand. So that kind of at least separated Jake Paul from non-combat sports athletes that were thinking about lacing up the gloves. And then things got only crazier from there. He fought the mixed martial artist, but non-striking heavy, but a former Bellator champ, a former ONE champ, Ben Askren, totally a non-striker, super renowned, nationally renowned wrestler, and Jake Paul knocked him out in the first round, which, I mean, that was interesting because you've got at least a combat sports fighter who's been in there with Robbie Lawler. And, you know, Ben Askren beat Robbie Lawler. So Ben Askren had been in there with other very good strikers. So it's not like striking was totally foreign to him. It's just that he wasn't looking to engage in striking battles. He would want to take the fight into where his skill set would become prevalent. And then after that Ben Askren knockout in the first round, then the 2 fights versus Tyron Woodley came. First was a split decision win for Jake Paul, where Jake Paul kind of got backed up against the ropes a little bit in the middle rounds. Close fight, competitive fight, but it's like, damn, Jake Paul just edged Tyron Woodley, former UFC champ with several title defenses, who was a good striker. Granted, Tyron Woodley had lost his last few fights before exiting the UFC, but still, you would have never guessed a couple years prior that Jake Paul would be beating up on Tyron Woodley, and then they got the rematch, which was a pretty lackluster affair until Jake absolutely blasted Tyron Woodley in the 6th round with an overhand right after kind of feinting and jabbing to the body. A lot of people thought that was like a fake setup to the punch, like that scenario wasn't real. I tend to believe that was absolutely real. We saw, Canelo do it to Amir Khan. It's one of the oldest tricks in the book, where you go low, fake low, and go high. Like, people get caught with that. Even professional boxers get caught with that. If you are not on your P's and Q's and you let the opponent start to kind of set up shop and set up the heavier shots. So this was pretty shocking. Again, people forget how boring of a fight it was and how tired and lethargic both fighters looked up until that knockout. It's not like Jake Paul was dominating that fight and then knocked Woodley out. No, it was pretty much a snoozer that looked like it was so bad that it was taking the air out of this whole non-professional boxers engaging in professional boxing arena. Like, it looked like, hey, this could kind of put this whole, not only Jake Paul run, but that whole side combat sports environment, it could put that in peril because of how bad of a fight that was, until, again, Jake Paul saved the day with that beautiful 6-round knockout. And then he fights Anderson Silva, who, yes, was in his mid-40s, but people thought that the jig was up. Hey, now you're fighting arguably the greatest mixed martial arts striker of all time. I tend to believe Anderson Silva is the greatest mixed martial arts striker of all time, who did have a little bit of a boxing background and who did beat former middleweight champ Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. in a boxing fight. Anderson Silva had just done that like a year and a half prior. So heading into Jake Paul versus Anderson Silva, a lot of people were like, hey, I think Anderson Silva could take this one. And you know, Anderson Silva for once was somebody who was close to Jake Paul's size. Jake Paul had been fighting, you know, either 170-pound mixed martial artists like Woodley and Askren or undersized basketball players like Nate Robinson. Well, Anderson Silva was every bit of 6'1", about the same height, maybe even a shade taller than Jake Paul, and who had competed for most of his whole career at 185 middleweight or at 205 for a couple of fights, like against James Irwin and against Forrest Griffin, and then later on against Daniel Cormier at 205. So Anderson Silva was also bigger than most of Jake Paul's prior opponents. And again, he was much trickier and much more fundamental a striker. But Jake Paul won a close fight, and he dropped Anderson Silva in the final 8th round. So going into Tommy Fury against Jake Paul, it was like, yeah, Tommy Fury's a boxer though, and he's an actual, you know, cruiserweight who's even bigger than Anderson Silva. And Tommy Fury, I think, surprised a lot of people in the way that he moved around the ring, showed that proverbial ring generalship, and kind of outboxed Jake Paul. Jake Paul did score a late knockdown. This ended up being a split decision win. But you know, I thought that Tommy Fury won 5, maybe even 6 rounds against Jake Paul. But again, it was a split decision win for Tommy Fury. And so a lot of people were like, okay, does that kind of end this whole show? Well, not if you pick an opponent with the name recognition of a Nate Diaz. Yes, this is, in my view, kind of a step back in opponent quality by boxing standards. Like, I think that Anderson Silva is a better boxer and fighter than Nate Diaz. Tommy Fury, obviously. Hell, Tyron Woodley had a better MMA career than Nate Diaz. Tyron Woodley, again, a champion with a few title defenses. Nate Diaz never won a UFC title. I think he competed for the belt once and lost via unanimous decision against Benson Henderson, a long-time 155-pound champion. So that's another thing about this fight. I'm looking at the size as an actual factor here. Again, Tyron Woodley was a career-long 170 guy. Anderson Silva, again, a middleweight 185. Nate Diaz, at his best and most competitive, 155 guy. It was his brother Nick Diaz who was the 170 pounder challenging George St. Pierre for the welterweight belt. It wasn't until Nate Diaz was like fighting Conor McGregor, and Nate Diaz was basically saying, yeah, I'll fight him on late notice, after RDA, Rafael Dos Anjos, stepped out of a Conor McGregor fight, had to pull out of the fight. Nate Diaz was a late replacement. A lot of people forget that. And Nate Diaz is like, yeah, I'll do it, but I ain't coming all the way down to 155. You're going to have to come up and see me at 170. That was the fight that Nate Diaz beat Conor McGregor. So if you look at Nate Diaz's 170 career, the only guys that he beat were Conor McGregor the first time. The second time was a close decision, majority decision win for Conor McGregor. Very disputed, very close. But Conor McGregor was a 145 guy at the time that he fought Nate Diaz at 170. Conor hadn't even settled into 155 yet against, you know, Habib and so forth. Conor was a 145 guy jumping all the way to 170. So Nate Diaz beat him. Nate Diaz beat Anthony Showtime Pettis, a former 155-pound champion who, again, was competing for a few fights at 170. But Anthony Showtime Pettis is not a 170 guy. Yes, he did just beat Roy Jones in a boxing fight, which is, in my view, totally embarrassing. I mean, come on. But yeah, that was another one of Nate Diaz's 170 wins. And then in his final UFC fight, he beat, you know, 155 Tony Ferguson, who's like now on a 6-fight losing streak. So Ferguson had lost like 4 in a row heading into that fight with Nate Diaz. And, you know, that was a competitive fight until Nate Diaz rocked Tony Ferguson in the 4th round, ended up securing a guillotine choke. Tony Ferguson was competitive with Nate in the stand-up of that fight. So again, Nate Diaz isn't beating 170 guys at 170. He's beating 155 or even 145 guys at 170. And then if you look at Nate's losses at 170, it was that rematch against Conor McGregor. It was the 3rd round stoppage against Jorge Masvidal. And then it was against Leon Edwards, the current welterweight champion, where yes, Nate Diaz did rock Leon Edwards very late in the fight. In the 5th and final round, he rocked Leon Edwards. Edwards, but Edwards had won rounds 1 through 4, so he was kind of coasting to a wide decision win. And then Masvidal didn't lose a round against Nate Diaz. And I mean, it was very disappointing that the fight was stopped because you never know with Nate Diaz, but Masvidal had dropped Nate multiple times, bloodied him up, which is why the fight was stopped, because Nate Diaz has so much scar tissue around his eye area that he bleeds in like over half of his fights. That's another concern here. So you've got the bigger, 200-pound-ish Jake Paul versus the at his best 155 Nate Diaz. Not to say that he should or would be at his best at 155 today. I think that Nate has truly outgrown that, but 170 at most, you know what I mean? But this fight between Paul and Diaz is going to be at a catch weight of 185. So that's 10 pounds over the light heavyweight in boxing. Light heavyweight limit is 15 pounds heavier than Nate Diaz has ever competed in the octagon. And I look at Jake, I might have said cruiserweight, which is a 200-pound limit, but Jake is really like a 190 guy. Like if there was a 190-pound weight class, that would be where Jake competes, something like that. You know how between certain divisions, there's a huge jump? Well, between light heavyweight in boxing and cruiserweight, it's 175 and 200. That's a 25-pound gulf. So this 185 catch weight, I think actually works for Jake Paul more than it does Nate Diaz any favors. You know what I mean? This to me favors Jake Paul. And Nate Diaz isn't a knockout guy at 170. So I'm just wondering what he has for Jake Paul in a boxing ring at 185. And when I size up Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz, one thing that always interested me, or I found interesting about the Diaz brothers, was that even back in the day, you had renowned future Hall of Fame, now Hall of Fame, but then future Hall of Famers like Andre Ward vouching for Nick Diaz at the time and saying, oh no, this guy could really hold his own in a boxing ring. Andre Ward was vouching for Nick Diaz back in the day. And I just saw like a clip of Mikey Garcia, that's esteemed renowned trainer Robert Garcia's little brother. Mikey Garcia was a former champ at 126, 130, 135, serious boxer. He went way up to fight Errol Spence Jr. Errol Spence gave Mikey his first career loss. And Mikey Garcia was doing like an interview with like Fight Hype or Fight Hub, one of those outlets. Sorry if I gave the wrong outlet, but Mikey Garcia was vouching for Nate Diaz's boxing, not MMA boxing, but boxing abilities in this video from like a couple weeks ago. I'm like, are the Diaz's paying these boxers to vouch for their skills as boxers? Because I've seen Nate Diaz like his whole career, and yes, he does have hands. Yes, he does have volume. At least used to have a lot of volume. He's a little bit of like a boxing zombie, where he'll kind of either have his hands here or have his hands like down at his waist. Which, I mean, good luck trying that against somebody who's been boxing a lot over the past 4 years in Jake Paul. So Nate Diaz didn't strike me as a skilled boxer when I would see his MMA fights. Like if you look at him fighting Jorge Masvidal, Masvidal was boxing, kickboxing Nate Diaz's ears off. Like again, he dropped them multiple times. Conor McGregor in that rematch dropped Nate Diaz just with the hands. It was just like a hands affair mostly in that first round. Conor McGregor dropped Nate Diaz like 3 times in the first round, to where he would drop him and then take a step back and dare Nate Diaz to, to get up. Like Conor was making a show out of it. And yes, this ended up being a 5-round battle of attrition. But I'm just saying, when both guys are at their sharpest, I expect Jake Paul to be way crisper than Nate Diaz, who I've always seen as being kind of a sloppy-ish striker, but it's effective if you start giving the guy momentum and he starts kind of fighting downhill. But like when he beat Anthony Pettis, it wasn't because he outboxed Anthony Pettis. He kind of he out-wrestled and out-grappled Anthony Pettis in that fight. And, when he fought Leon Edwards was outboxing him, out-kickboxing him. He was kind of hitting without getting hit. Again, it wasn't until like the 5th and final round that Nate Diaz even looked very competitive against Leon Edwards. So I'm expecting Jake Paul to win the first round against Nate Diaz. Look, the only chance I see Nate Diaz having here, and they list him as a southpaw, but his style is almost so unorthodox and sloppy that you would almost not even know that Nate Diaz is a southpaw. Like, I've got to see what Nate Diaz even looks like in a conventional boxing stance and flicking a jab out, because again, his style is so Stockton slappish and so, hands down, flipping you off with both hands and just kind of, trying to piece you up with 1-2s. Now, he does have a nice 1-2, and yes, he does kind of play angles pretty well. He's got relatively long arms. In this case, him and Jake Paul both have 76-inch reaches. Tommy Fury, again, the guy who was moving around the ring, which I don't expect Nate Diaz to do. Tommy Fury, who was showing a lot of great feints and showing a fast combinations. I didn't expect Tommy Fury to look that quick. Usually guys who are that jacked up muscularly don't throw their hands that fast, but Tommy Fury looked like the quicker of the two fighters between he and Jake Paul. I don't expect that to be the case with Nate Diaz. I don't expect, Nate Diaz to move in the way that Tommy Fury did. And Tommy Fury has an 80-inch reach to Jake Paul and Nate Diaz's 76-inch reaches. But yeah, Nate Diaz does do some things well. Like, he'll kind of lead you with his lead right hand, kind of either smack you with the right hand or do something where he's just kind of swiping with the right to kind of make your head move over that way so he could catch you with the left. He did it with Conor McGregor a few times in the first fight and in the second fight. And, Nate Diaz will throw a nice hook at the end of a combination. And he'll sometimes throw like a 1-2 that looks like it's going to stop with the 2, and then he'll throw one more with his lead hand on top of the 2. So he'll throw the right left and then throw one more right on top of that, or he'll flip it and throw left right and then throw one more left on top of that. But I just don't know how those things are going to translate in the boxing ring. Nate Diaz also doesn't have the cleanest footwork, so I could see Nate Diaz's fight style, unless he just changes into a pure boxer overnight, which I don't expect. So if he's gonna kind of fight with the MMA boxing style or anything close to it, his feet get crossed up all the time, where if you are a skilled and well-timed boxer, you could see him coming in with the 1-2 and then kind of catch him between the 2 and the 3, where his feet will be kind of out of position, and then you could just put him on his butt in those moments. Like, think about, I'm not going to expect Jake Paul to take on Terrence Crawford like timing, but the way that Crawford was catching Errol Spence between punches, Jake Paul can do that with a Nate Diaz, especially if Jake Paul has hands that are as fast or faster than Nate Diaz's. I think that Nate Diaz's only a chance here is if he totally gasses Jake Paul out. And again, Nate Diaz does have good cardio. He does like decathlons and, different things to just kind of keep his cardio and his overall athleticism up. But Nate Diaz strikes me as the type of athlete, he and his brother, who are more attrition, long muscle type athletes, not quick twitch or just high performance athletes. I see them as being high endurance athletes, but not like anything that jumps off the page strength wise, speed wise, coordination wise. I don't see any of that really with Nate Diaz. I expect Jake Paul, again, to look like the crisper puncher between the two. But again, Nate Diaz's only chance, in my view, is if he could somehow get Jake Paul to empty out the gas tank in the middle rounds. And again, this is going to be Jake Paul's first 10-rounder. But again, this is Nate Diaz's boxing debut. Not to say that 5-minute rounds in the cage isn't absolute hell. That is super grueling. Look at some of those 5-round MMA fights. It's almost inhumane, some of them, right? But Nate Diaz hasn't fought 10 3-minute boxing rounds in a actual boxing style fight. So even though this is 2 rounds more than Jake Paul's accustomed to, again, he dropped Tommy Fury late in an 8-rounder. He dropped Anderson Silva in the 8th round of an 8-rounder. He knocked Tyron Woodley out in the 6th round. So it's not like Jake Paul's power doesn't carry late, But maybe if Nate Diaz can get Jake Paul tired in the middle rounds, then perhaps Jake Paul's punch volume can decrease in the, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th rounds to where Nate Diaz can, win on the scorecards because you've got an exhausted Jake Paul. I just think that it's more likely that Jake Paul lands cleanly with jabs. And I think he's going to be jabbing to Nate Diaz's body as well to set up that right hand over the top. And if he catches Nate Diaz over the top, I think he could either drop Nate Diaz or he could at least bloody Nate Diaz up. I wouldn't be surprised if this fight gets stopped due to cuts. That wouldn't surprise me at all. But I think that Jake Paul is actually going to put a beating on Nate Diaz. I expect him to win at least 2 of the first 3 rounds. I expect him to win probably most of the 4th through 6th rounds. Like, I've really got to see what Nate Diaz looks like in a boxing ring. Because again, I'm just having visions of a very non-crisp puncher, a very non-clean defensive fighter. Like Nate Diaz, has a lot of attributes. Great defense is not one of them. It really is not. And if he's going to be getting caught cleanly by, again, Nate Diaz could be putting on some pounds to grow up to a 190, 185 looking fighter. Jake Paul is the bigger guy. He just, from shoulder to shoulder, Jake Paul is in his, mid to late 20s. He's 26 years old right now. Nate Diaz, unless you just start packing on fat, isn't going to just all of a sudden become a bigger guy. So he's going to be inflating his body. Even though he said that he stopped doing that, he even admitted that his regimen in gaining weight was uncomfortable for him. So again, Jake Paul, I assume, is going to be much bigger than Nate Diaz. I think Nate Diaz is going to be picking up a check here, but I expect Jake Paul to put a beating on him. I would be surprised if this goes the full 10 rounds. I know that Nate Diaz is an attrition guy. Usually it's him wearing opponents out in the late rounds, but I just think that he's going to be getting caught too cleanly to not get bloodied up. I think, the doctor's going to be taking a look at him, after his cuts open up, and this might get stopped on cuts, or this, it's tough to see Nate Diaz get finished, like where it's not because a ref stopped the fight or something like that. But I think that ref stoppage is a real possibility here. But you would have to look all the way back to Nate Diaz's loss to Josh Thompson back in 2013, 10 years ago, to find the last time Nate Diaz got stopped, where it wasn't like somebody else's call, where he was getting beaten via TKO. And I remember Josh Thompson caught him with a head kick and then just caught him with 20 more shots after that as Nate Diaz was trying to recover. You know what would be kind of crazy, but not out of the realm of possibility? Jake Paul actually knocking Nate Diaz out, with a thumping right hand. I expect, this could go to the scorecards, and hats off to Nate Diaz if he does go a full 10 with Jake Paul. I just think that it's more likely, because again, Jake Paul's been working on his game, and I don't think that he's stopped working on his game after his loss to Tommy Fury. Maybe he's not training with the same vigor in these days as he was prior. One thing I will note is that he's not going to be training with BJ Flores, his longtime trainer, for this fight. He's actually training with boxing Hall of Famer Shane Mosley. That's actually my favorite boxer of all time. But just because a guy is a great boxer doesn't mean that it's going to translate to him being a great trainer. I'm actually curious to see what Shane Mosley can do as a trainer, because Mosley's one of these guys who had out of this world extraordinary talent, hand speed, power. Shane Mosley was sensational at his best. Long career too. But sometimes it's the technicians that don't have the God-given physical attributes that can impart the best wisdom. I would expect Bernard Hopkins to be a more effective trainer than a Shane Mosley. Like, Shane Mosley was so good that, I mean, no knock to his dad, Jack Mosley, but Jack Mosley, Shane Mosley's father, was Shane's trainer through most of his career, through like most of his prime. It was Jack Mosley that was training Shane Mosley. It wasn't until he picked up a couple of losses that he parted ways with his dad as lead trainer, and then went with like Nassim Richardson, the late great Nassim Richardson, among a couple of others. So I don't love that change in trainer for Jake Paul unless he's truly learning some different things that are going to better round out his game. If that's what's going on here, then that's great for Jake Paul. If he is training as hard or even harder than he was, you know, for the Askren fight, for the Woodley fight, Silva fight, and so forth, hats off to Jake Paul. I don't think that he has dropped off significantly in his willingness and his hunger to train. But I mean, he has gotten paid a lot. But I've got a lot of respect for Jake Paul's willingness to learn the game and his dedication to it. And I'm going to go with Jake Paul actually via late stoppage. It's either going to come after multiple knockdowns and maybe Nate Diaz up against the ropes, or maybe like a couple of cuts and just too many cuts, too much blood to where they stop the fight. But again, I would be surprised if this goes the full 10. I'm going Jake Paul via late stoppage. Again, I think that Nate Diaz is giving up too much size. I don't think he's going to have been thumped as hard as he's going to be getting hit against Jake Paul, even against Conor McGregor and Jorge Masvidal. I think that Jake Paul, again, knocked down Anderson Silva in the last round. I'm going with Jake Paul here. Let me know your thoughts on Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz. And if Jake Paul does win here, does he then go back and fight another boxer, perhaps a rematch against Tommy Fury, who is supposed to be fighting KSI? Damn, if KSI is able to pull that off, that would be impressive. I think Tommy Fury should win against KSI, even though KSI's looked really good against these other non-boxers and YouTubers, right? KSI, aside from Jake Paul, it seems like KSI is about as good as it gets in that realm. But if Tommy Fury gets past KSI, will it be Jake Paul versus Tommy Fury in a rematch, assuming Paul beats Nate Diaz here? Or if KSI wins, do they finally make the Jake Paul versus KSI fight? KSI has fought Logan Paul twice, but they haven't yet done Jake Paul versus KSI. They've done, you know, Jake Paul has one amateur fight. It's against KSI's brother, Deji, and Jake Paul won via 5th round TKO in that one. But yeah, I would be interested in seeing Jake Paul versus KSI. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on Paul versus Nate Diaz in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.